Some Pokemon were so ridiculously good that they didn't get themselves nerfed. No, they got entire mechanics nerfed, or new ones introduced to contain their power. That's right, they forced the developers to change the game around them instead. And if even Game Freak, the power creep happy developers of Pokemon, are afraid of a certain level of chaos, you know these cases were extreme. We're diving into 6 Pokemon whose impact was so seismic, Game Freak redrew the fault lines around them. If they hadn't, we'd be lost in Club Silencio, a world of illusion, as demonstrated by our first selection with Zoroark. In the first 4 generations, a team of Pokemon had a designated lead, which would start out battles no matter what. Furthermore, neither you nor the opponent knew what further Pokemon the other was packing until they were sent into battle. Makes sense, right? It mirrors the way we battle in-game. However, this was changed in Generation 5 and beyond, and it's all because of one Pokemon. On the surface, Zoroark is a thoroughly unimpressive Pokemon. It is a mono dark type, which is hardly anything to write home about. It's pretty fast, true, getting the jump on the famed base 100 tier, and it's got good special attack alongside Nasty Plot with great coverage and Flamethrower and Focus Blast to support its Stab Dark Pulse. That's a great array of tools, for a low tier Pokemon anyway. Zoroark is cardboard frail and isn't exactly packing a Gengar-esque array of resists and immunities to compensate for it, nor does it have the truly explosive power which also would help in that department. However, it completely changed the game as we know it. There is before Zoroark and there is after Zoroark. It upended the game on a fundamental level in spite of its many flaws, all because of its ability Illusion, which allowed it to pretend to be another Pokemon on its team before taking direct damage. Now, one might point out that Illusion isn't perfect, as even if Zoroark isn't hit by a direct attack, you might still know it's Zoroark based on indirect damage. For instance, if Breloom switches in, but it takes neutral damage from Stealth Rock, you know it's actually Zoroark. However, despite the imperfections, this is still one of the most potentially devastating advantages one could have. In the hands of a good player, one is hardly limited to using Zoroark to disguise Pokemon that it shares passive damage weaknesses with. This would make it much easier to play around, but it's not that simple. Unless the opponent messes up big time, you will never know if the opponent's Pokemon is Zoroark or not. This lead could be a Zoroark. Their second Pokemon could be a Zoroark. You don't even know if there is a Zoroark. They might not even have one. The scariest Zoroark might not just be the unseen one, but the one that may not even exist. You could play it completely straight without Zoroark on your team, and your opponent, so freaked out by the possibility of Zoroark popping up, might get tripped up and do something like leave Gliscor in on Starmie, because Starmie might actually be Zoroark. No, Zoroark isn't a world beater, but it's not exactly a slouch either. Its toolkit is perfectly serviceable to ruin something thinking it's facing something else, or a lot of something. You have Abomasnow facing Suicune, and suddenly this supposed Suicune unleashes Flamethrower. Goodbye, Abomasnow. Hello, incoming Suicune sweep. You don't need uber stats for a situation like that. That's why when Gen 5 came around, team preview and selecting leads was introduced for player versus player battles. Technically, this had existed before, but only in the spin-off games like Pokemon Stadium, never in the mainline series. But with team preview, Zoroark isn't actually that scary, as not only will you know it's on the other team before a single move is made, you also know all of the opponent's other Pokemon it can transform into, which takes a lot of the fear of the unknown out of the equation and allows you to play more easily. Seeing as Zoroark is actually not that effective, most players aren't even going to bother with it and its stat spread, which is more appropriate for the lower tiers where it wound up. This isn't actually about potentially the most game-breaking Pokemon that ever exists in and of itself though. You could still make an argument for Zoroark deserving this distinction without actually ever appearing in serious play because of how its existence created a complete overhaul of what was previously one of the most fundamental aspects of competitive Pokemon, playing blind, quote unquote. And it cannot be overstated how initially despised the very concept of team preview was in the early days of Generation 5. It was seen as a complete spit in the face of what the game should be. So much of what made the best players in the first 4 generations as good as they were was their ability to play blind, and to have this taken away had many players almost rioting to exclude the mechanic from play. Of course, team preview has long since been accepted as promoting its own type of skill, just as valid as the non-preview gens, and as being incredibly helpful to stave off the ever-increasing number of incredibly powerful threats. Imagine Volcarona in a world without team preview. But the fact is, the change was a result of one Pokemon whose own competitive impact was nil, though simultaneously it has also been immeasurable, and this paradox exists because the mechanic introduced to contain it made it so much less effective. Zoroark and its illusions were quite the game-changing prank, but as far as pranksters went, there was another that really went too far. Thundurus was a terror in singles, and even when you could manage to check it, it still probably left a nasty parting shot. Well, not literally, Wolfie, but in the form of its crippling prankster Thunderwave. Priority paralysis dished on many a would-be safe revenge killer. If they weren't ground, forget using your choice Scarfers for anything after that. Thundurus' T-Waves was not just used to thwart Pokemon that tried to check it, but also used to check opposing Pokemon itself, no matter how fast fast they were. Normally, you'd be fine sacrificing Thundurus if it meant stopping that boosted Dragon Dancer from sweeping your entire team, but thanks to full paralysis' sizable 25% proc rate, odds not much lower than a Scald Burn, you might not even have to lose Thundurus at all. By extension, you realize that Thunder Wave has a pretty good chance to counter just about everything. This realization has insidiously infested singles over the years, but as pernicious as that development has been, is nothing compared to Thundurus' antics over the course of 2 separate generations. In the first 5 generations, electric types could be Thunder Wave just like anything else, barring of course those with Volt Absorb or Lightning Rod in Gens 4 and 5. And since most electrics being used were the likes of Zapdos and the Rotom appliances, this meant Thundurus, especially with its talent for threatening just about any ground type you could throw at it, could click T-Wave against nearly anything, and that's exactly what it did. You could be as strong and as fast as you'd like, your odds at beating Thundurus would still probably top out at around 75%. This made for some seriously chaotic odds flying around, especially in conjunction with everyone's favorite VGC move, Rock Slide. As a result, in Generation 6, electric types could no longer be paralyzed. Sure, it was unfortunate that Thundurus could no longer para opposing electrics, but at the same time, Thundurus could no longer be paralyzed itself. Oh boy. Shockingly, Thundurus continued to dominate VGC in Gen 6 to truly absurd extents. Even with electrics no longer within the reach of its T-Wave, it still threatened priority paralysis on a preposterous proportion of the tier. In addition to paralysis, it also enjoyed priority swagger. Even if you couldn't paralyze you, the 50% confusion rate was horrifying, to say nothing of the effect of actually pairing it with para, meaning it had a skill-defined set of strong odds to beat just about anything. In 2015, the Thundurus and Landorus-filled metagame was dominated by Japanese players, including the eventual champion Shoma Honami. Ray Rizzle asked him what the best answer to Thundurus and Landorus was, and the response was, "There is no counter, you just use your own Thundurus and Landorus." As such, Thundurus' antics led to 2 more nerfs in Gen 7. Now, Prankster no longer worked against Dark type. However, even if you can get that dreaded Prankster T-Wave off, it's not quite as dreaded as it used to be. Paralysis used to be quarter of the opponent's speed. Now it only halved it. But there's still that 25% full paralysis rate though, right? Yes, but Thunder Wave was no longer 100% accurate. It was slashed down to 90%. Suddenly, Thundurus' Prankster utility had fewer targets, and even the fewer targets that remained were no longer nearly as threatened by it. Thundurus pranked its way into having mechanics changed repeatedly. And speaking of, there was another irritating Pokemon that had the player base dogging Game Freak for a change. Remember how Zoroark had the player base rioting in the early days of Generation 5 over the existence of Team Preview? 2016 Smeargle was the VGC equivalent of that, except the Storm, which was arguably even more intense, never wound up subsiding. Players eventually realized that Team Preview was fine, a good thing even. No such epiphanies ever came to pass regarding Smeargle turning every game it was into a short yet brutal cluster of broken threats and infuriating odds. The player base was positively screaming at TPCI to ban Smeargle, because Smeargle packed a Dark Void that slapped both opposing Pokemon and couldn't be blocked by grass types or safety goggles the way Spore or Sleep Powder would. This was already devastating considering Smeargle's teammates were broken restricted Pokemon like Mega Rayquaza, the Primos, and Geomancy Xerneas, but was made especially ludicrous by Smeargle's ability, Moody, whose extreme random stat boosting meant it became quite difficult to take out in spite of its non-existent defensive profile. One evasion boost and you were missing it with so-called 100% accurate moves, a defense boost and you were taking it out despite your strength, a speed boost and it had an even easier time sleeping you. These intense odds alongside those of Dark Void's accuracy and sleep duration were game-breaking considering how short games were when dealing with the instant win threats like Xerneas. This Pokemon that couldn't do damage to save its life was so thoroughly busted that Game Freak wound up nerfing its tools twice. In a famously short-sighted example of overkill, Gen 7 saw them nerf Dark Void so that if any Pokemon beyond Darkrai used it, it would fail. Amazing, problem solved, as Darkrai was a mythical Pokemon that was thus not allowed in VGC. However, you can't be too safe, Game Freak said, as they also nerfed Dark Void's accuracy from 80% all the way down to 50%, thereby making sure Darkrai was also completely ruined in singles, all because of something a completely different Pokemon in a completely different format had done. That wasn't all either. Finally, recognizing they might have gone slightly over the top with Moody, just a bit, Smeargle also prompted Gen 8's nerf to the ability, which now no longer boosted evasion or accuracy. It's still ridiculously broken, of course, but at least you won't be randomly dodging earthquakes with it. Now, people may have called bull on Smeargle many a time, but as much RNG-driven nonsense as it was responsible for, it couldn't compete with the king bull. Tauros, that's right. Tauros is the essence of Gen 1. It completely defines the generation's RNG-influenced style, and was so powerful in doing so that the very way it operated ceased to exist in the following generation. The saying goes, when there's a Tauros, there's a way. Tauros didn't just have an incredibly spammable normal stab, it had normal stab that fully took advantage of Gen 1's Pokemon's most brutal mechanics. First, any one of Tauros' attacks had a great crit rate. Thanks to its excellent base speed, not only did it outrun you, but it was rewarded with a 21.4% chance to do double damage for it. Newer players may not know that pre-Gen 6, crits did double, not 1.5. This already made Tauros' Body Slam quite a pain to switch into, but where the danger really appeared was in the much more powerful, high-risk, high-reward attack, Hyper Beam. Tauros' ultimate move was ferocious because in Gen 1, it didn't force a recharge turn upon the user if it KO'd its target. And given how strong Stab Hyper Beam already was in addition to Tauros' excellent crit rate, this was not at all difficult. Playing around Tauros late or even mid-game was walking on eggshells in the best of circumstances, and you could even be out of Hyper Beam range, but you were rarely going to be out of range of crit Hyper Beam. And as if all that wasn't enough, Tauros' Blizzard, whose coverage ensured Rhydon was not at all a safe answer to its normal stab, also had the potential for ruinous RNG. It was unlikely, but if Tauros' Blizzard froze, Gen 1 mechanics ensured the target was not thawing on its own, ever. Tauros was far from the only Pokemon with a high crit rate, or Stab Hyper Beam, or the ability to deal a perma-freeze, but the fact that it had all of them was incredible. In fact, in the real-life tournaments held in the late 90s, Tauros was completely and utterly dominant. Then in Gen 2, all of this disappeared. Crit rates went from being dependent on base speed to a flat 6.25% across the board, which would remain until Gen 7 knocked them down further to 4.17%. Hyper Beam would now force the user to recharge even upon scoring a KO. Freeze was no longer permanent unless acted on. The freeze change Tauros could live with, but the crit rate, Hyper Beam, these were, if you'll pardon my French, its entire raison d'etre, or its reason for existing. Game Freak had targeted precisely the mechanics which had made it such an unstoppable threat, such a mandatory competitive presence, and rendered them obsolete. And in doing so, they did the same to Tauros, who couldn't hack it without its terrifying slams and beams existing, as they did in their original incarnation. Now, it wasn't the only time sheer strength made the usual power-happy Game Freak tone things down either, as in Gen 7, there were abilities so nice, they nerfed them thrice. With the Tapus, of course. Many players might not know or have forgotten that the terrains were actually introduced in Gen 6. They just weren't used, beyond a rare bordering on non-existent Misty Terrain Xerneas set in Ubers. They weren't used not because their effects were bad, but because with their short duration and costly move slot, they weren't worth the effort, as nice as the benefits could have been. Now if the terrain extender item had existed, they'd be much likelier to find some sort of niche, but still, like weather conditions, they'd be best if a Pokemon could summon them upon switch-in through an ability. When Pokemon were able to do so in Generation 7, the full power of the terrains was put on display, and boy were they strong. Both singles and VGC were ruled by the Tapus and the terrains that their surge abilities summoned. It certainly helped that the Pokemon setting them were also excellent in their own right, even when the terrain was down, but they themselves were of course at their best with it active, and in VGC, they were especially impactful since the teammates they set up could share the field with them, making the wide-reaching effect even more immediate. Having to stare down Tapu Lele's insane psychic power on par with Latios' Draco Meteor, and not being able to target its teammate with priority, yikes. The various terrain side effects were great, of course. Grassy terrain's weakening of Earthquake was especially appreciated, but the most impactful was that of the major 50% power boost the Grass, Electric, and Psychic terrains gave their respective types. This free choice item level boost made for staggering power that in cases was outright overwhelming, especially since not only did the boost come without move restriction, but could be stacked with other boosts easily. Monster teammates like Kartana became ludicrously powerful, and immediately. This was no protracted setup, the numbers were as instant as they were insane. The terrains defining the game didn't have to be a bad thing necessarily, but in their ubiquity, they certainly pushed the envelope in terms of acceptable power and support. As such, when Gen 8 came around, Grassy, Electric, and Psychic terrains were nerfed so as to only provide a 30% boost to their respective moves. This is still sizable strength being afforded to its beneficiaries, of course. Life Orb level power without taking up an item slot or that pesky 10% recoil is really good, but the strength is no longer quite as over the top, which is key given the other major benefits of the terrain. It seems for the best. Imagine Gen 8's Rillaboom and its priority Grassy Glide, which already delivers serious damage if it were buffed by 50% instead of 30. The only terrain to not get nerfed was Misty Terrain, which was the only terrain that didn't actually boost damage. In fact, in Gen 8, it got the opposite treatment, where it powered up the newly added Misty Explosion by 50%. Given the specificity of such a move, which still isn't that strong by the way, and it feints the user, this is hardly anywhere close to overbearing. The terrains are still extraordinary pieces of support, including for their power, as further demonstrated by other Pokemon receiving them like Pincurchin and Indeedee F, and the Tapus continued their own excellence, but their own power previously led them to lose some of it for the stranglehold they had on the game. And before we get to our number one, we've got some quick honorable mentions. Amoonguss may seem like an unusual choice, but in Gen 5, its spores shut everything down, even grass types. Much like Thunderwave used to be just as valid against electrics as anything else. Furthermore, VGC saw its incredible redirecting Rage Powder exploited to tremendous effect. In Gen 6, neither Spore nor Rage Powder are able to affect grass types anymore, and the new safety goggles provided their user immunity to them. And our other honorable mention is Gen 7 Machamp, which seems set to have its no guard ability reunited with the one-hit KO move Fisher that it had in the first 2 generations through the same virtual game re-release time capsule method that gifted Scizor Curse, which Scizor had in Gen 2. But by total coincidence, no guard and Fissure were incompatible. Yeah, Game Freak definitely didn't go out of their way to avoid chaos on that one. Now on to our grand finale with Liepard, because Liepard's antics in both singles and VGC had the Zoroark-like effect of having mechanics changed in its wake. Liepard wreaked havoc with a gimmicky yet potentially auto-winning strategy in both formats. In singles, it wielded its unique combination of Prankster and Assist on teams dedicated to making said assists only able to call phasing moves, meaning Liepard would be able to spam priority phasing to destroy hapless opponents who were forced to switch around entry hazards, which were set up by Liepard's team using Ditto to copy the opponent's Stealth Rocker. This was pretty nuts, though it didn't work too reliably at a high level in a metagame full of Magic Guard. It had the potential to be absolutely ruinous, plus even a last Pokemon, Reuniclus, would lose to Liepard's nasty plotted Stab Dark Pulse. And if you thought maybe you needed more priority assists to really destroy the opponent, Liepard sometimes partnered up with its pre-evolution, Purloin. VGC doesn't have hazards at all though, so why did Liepard manage to cause a shift in game mechanics? Funnily enough, it was mandated that both Liepard and Purloin teamed up here, both using Prankster and Assist once again. The move they called through Assist was different this time, and that move was Dive. The Dive Catch strategy, as it was called, took full advantage of the term of semi-invulnerability a Pokemon has on the first turn of a move Dive, Fly, or Shadow Force. With Prankster, Liepard and Purloin would always go first and call Dive with Assist, launching them underwater and thus safe from opposing moves. However, Dive is not a move that any Pokemon would do much damage with, let alone Liep and Purloin of all things. So don't they just get obliterated once they're no longer semi-invulnerable? Nope, they'd be holding Lagging Tail and Full Instance, items which make the user go last. Unless it's using priority, of course. On this second turn that they'd be using Dive, Prankster thus would not be active, and the items allowed them to move after the opponent, allowing them to remain semi-invulnerable for both turns of Dive's use, even against targets with the same speed stats. Now, Liepard and Purloin would take forever to actually KO opponents, but it didn't matter. They'd stay at full health while chipping the opponent, meaning their user would win on timer. Now, there was counterplay like faster priority, but it was quite limited, and these cats auto-won many a game. If they had been discovered earlier in the generation, they surely would have caused more of a shakeup. Come Gen 6, Game Freak had realized their mistake and made it so that Assist could no longer call semi-invulnerable moves anymore. And it wasn't just that either. Gen 6 also made it so that Assist could no longer call phasing moves. Talk about reshaping the game. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbees, Corman, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.